So there are more advisories than they can handle. This is what we are trying to solve with the Common Security Advisory Framework.
Welcome everyone to the Industrial Security Podcast. My name is Nate Nelson. I'm sitting as usual with Andrew Ginter, the Vice President of Industrial Security at Waterfall Security Solutions. He's going to introduce the subject and the guest of today's show. Andrew, how's it going?
I'm very well, thank you, Nate. Our guest today is Jens Wiesner. He is the team lead for Industrial Control Systems Security at BSI in Germany. And we're going to be talking about the brand new Common Security Advisory Framework that BSI folks were very involved in helping to develop. Hello, gents, and welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you do at BSI?
So BSI is the German Federal Office for Information Security. We are a mixture between CISA and NIST. So we do some standardization, but we also do a lot of cybersecurity for governmental networks as well as for critical infrastructure protection. And we have a big team for public outreach and small and medium enterprises, and for example, my mother or my uncle. And I'm team lead for Industrial Control Systems. I somewhat joke that I'm the Marty Edwards of Germany, which is only by title but not by my team strength. I'm responsible for technical aspects of critical infrastructure protection, of device security, of incident analysis, and as well as advising critical infrastructures if vulnerabilities which might affect their operations come to light.
Okay, and we are talking about the Common Security Advisory Framework. Before we get into that framework, which is the solution to a problem, can you tell us what is the problem? What problem is this framework designed to solve?
So there are several stories. One story is, as I mentioned before, my office or my team especially is tasked with reading advisories and assessing their impact or the impact of the described vulnerabilities on German critical infrastructures. That means that we have to read all advisories from all relevant vendors. That's much more than ICS CERT is publishing. And we have to assess their impact. And over the last years, we saw that the number of vulnerabilities, which is a bit easier to measure than the number of advisories, the number of vulnerabilities of CVEs is growing more or less exponentially. And if more vendors do their due diligence, which they should do, and for each vulnerability issue an advisory, then the number of advisories and perhaps even patches and updates will rise even so, perhaps not exponentially, but very steady. And I am burning members of my team just reading these advisories and finding them and shifting through them. And each vendor is using a different type of advisory. And that's they use different wording. One you find on a support homepage, one is published in PDF, one is via RSS feeds, some companies Twitter about their advisories. And it's very difficult for us, and we are already trained professionals. And yeah, we can't keep up, or it's obvious that in future times we won't be able to keep up, and that's a real problem. And companies have the same issue. So there are more advisories than they can handle. And this is what we are trying to solve with the Common Security Advisory Framework.
So Jens described the number of vulnerabilities, the number of advisories he's seeing is growing, as he put it, exponentially. Andrew, in your experience, is the growth really that stark and that worrisome?
That might have been a bit of an exaggeration. Technically, exponentially is something like, increasing by 50% every year compounding. And I'm not sure that exponential is technically accurate, but the number is increasing dramatically. A topic that we come to much later in the interview is the interaction with SBOM, the software bill of materials. And with that sort of approach, the bill of materials approach to vulnerabilities and vulnerability reporting coming in, everybody who reports vulnerabilities tends to be reporting more of them. And with the trend towards increased awareness of security, lots of vendors who currently don't issue vulnerability reports have had their customers leaning on them saying, yeah, you better start doing this. So yeah, the number is increasing, better than steadily. So the problem is becoming sort of fairly drastically worse with every year that goes by, I think is the point.
So is what you're saying that the number is going up because of more and more frequent reporting rather than the number of vulnerabilities themselves increasing?
I think it's more complicated than that. To say the number of vulnerabilities is increasing suggests that people are writing sloppier and sloppier software. I'm not sure that today's software is any more sloppy than before. What we are seeing is more people, more vendors investing in discovering security vulnerabilities, paying attention to security vulnerabilities, telling their customers about the vulnerabilities that they discover that in the past they might just silently have fixed. And we're certainly seeing, more attention to security and thereby vulnerability. So, there's a number of factors that are combining to increase the number of vulnerability reports. And it's the reporting process here that end users are going, I can't even find all of these reports, much less, analyze them in all of the different formats and all of the different venues where they come out. We need something to help make sense of all this.
Right. I think that was sort of Jens's point, that these advisories are released presumably for our benefit, for our perusal, but if I were running whatever organization, it would just seem to be a little bit of an information overload. Each of these advisories is rather substantial on their own, let alone once they multiply. So I guess the solution is what you're going to be talking about with Jens coming up.
Okay, so we've talked about the problem. We're here to talk about the Common Security Advisory Framework. What is the framework, and how does it solve the problem?
CSAF is a standard which describes how information is put into a JSON file. So it's simply a standard, a formatting of JSON, of the fields which are mandatory, of the fields which are optional, which create a well-defined entry into a database-like file. And it is... it's a text file in the end. It's no rocket science. And one asks, why hasn't this been done already much earlier?
Is it an XML file?
No, it's JSON. This is the interesting part. JSON is the successor, more or less, to XML. It's a structured file like XML, but it's much smaller and it's more lightweight than XML, but it has the same structure, or you can describe the same objects like you can do in XML. Probably the gods of JSON and XML will punish me now, but it's more or less the same.
Okay, so you've described a standard format for security advisories. Was formatting the only problem, or did you have issues of access or completeness or something else? It sounded like you described a bigger problem. Does JSON solve a bigger problem than just formatting?
So CSAF describes, on the one hand, the structure of the file, but with the structure directly connected is the contents. So what you have to put into the file. And CSAF also describes a way where to find these advisories on a homepage. So the standard is more, and it describes also a role model who is allowed to edit this standard. So the files and how to perform some review processes. So it's more than simply a JSON file and and the contents of this file. It's a complete ecosystem of advisory generation and handling.
So one of the big uses that I've seen people make of these security advisories is to figure out whether a patch, a security update, applies to them And which of their equipment it applies to, so that they can apply the patch to the equipment. But I've also seen a lot of people, a lot of industries, very slow to patch. So can you talk about the process of patching and how these advisories fit in? What industries are going to use this? Are there entire industries where patching is so slow that in a sense it's irrelevant here? Who is using this? Who's going to use this most vigorously?
I can't name one sector, one industry who will jump on this, because we are targeting in the end every sector which has interconnected components, systems, machines. So everything who is not standalone, who is somewhat connected to other systems, which should be, I think, nearly every system or nearly every modern industry is affected by, or falls under this definition. And the main thing is that compared to home office or private IT or mobile phones, automatic updates don't apply. So for all systems which don't use automatic updates, and which is industry as a whole probably, where downtime has to be scheduled, and there are only certain windows where you can apply patches and updates, and they have to be tested, and these are the industries which we are focusing on, the ones which are reluctant, the ones which, as I said before, which don't have the manpower to follow or to read all the necessary information and know that they are at risk. These ones should be or will get an easier access and will get a better model of use. And concerning model of use, so the way we think CSAF will work is you have a local asset management. Without a local asset management, you can't protect what you don't know. So you have this local asset management, and you will have some systems around it, which will do some magic matching to the CSAF advisories. At the moment, these systems don't exist, but that's a different topic. But these systems will exist, and they will tell you, okay, you have the following systems which need to be patched. And in the first step, you will simply get a list of vulnerable systems, of systems which need to be patched. And that's a major step forward from now, where you have to, most of the times, manually look in some Excel spreadsheets, in other documentation, where you have to send out this information to other areas of your company, to other people, and say, are you affected by this advisory, by this vulnerability? And this can all be automated. And then you can put on top a risk management and can say, okay, these are the 100 patches I have to apply, but which ones are the worst ones? Which ones? And you can connect it to your local risk management, and then you can do informed decisions. And this is one of the major things which CSAF, why we see CSAF as a game changer, because at the moment you are always behind, and you are always you wait till the patches, the information about the patches or updates arrive. You could and then look for the affected system and then schedule it. And in the end, it's like you have only three options. You can say, it's extremely critical, I stop the process now and patch immediately because it's extremely dangerous, which is fortunately rare. You have the one, you say, okay, I wait till the next maintenance cycle. Or you say, I accept the risk, or it's not applicable. You do nothing. You have only these three choices. And to make a decision between these three choices, CSAF is the way to go, because now you are enabled to doing so.
You talked about options: patch now, patch later, or accept the risk, do nothing. I thought there was another option: compensating controls. If it's a service that's vulnerable, turn off the service because you're not using it, because you don't need it, or something like that. Is that not another option here?
You're right, Andrew. It depends on the service itself. If you can do this on the fly, if you can do this during operations, or if you have to wait for this maintenance cycle. And when I'm talking about patches and updates, this is an incomplete description of CSAF, because CSAF also includes mitigating countermeasures. So you can't always perform a patch or an update, and the mitigating countermeasure is always included, or is also, or may be included if no patch is available, or additionally included into CSAF. So this as I said, informed decision, and countermeasures are always an option if the vendor is able to provide one.
So the bottom line to me, Nate, is automation. This CSAF, this standard, enables vendors to import these advisories into their tools in a standard way. It enables vendors to presumably have go to a smaller number of predictable locations to find these standard advisories, so that their tools can figure out which of these advisories apply to which machines, which of these machines are production critical, which of them are safety critical. If there's more and more advisories coming, automation is the answer, and you need a standard to enable that automation effectively.
This is something that I've been encountering a lot recently in IT, actually. I think that possibly following from GDPR in Europe, and maybe even the California Consumer Privacy Act or Protection Act, a lot of vendors are starting to create software that automatically applies software updates and sort of patches vulnerabilities so that IT organizations can stay secure and up to date. But I guess it's happening in industrial security as well now.
That's right. And the question of applying security updates in the industrial space has always been a much harder question to answer than in the IT space. There's certainly interest in this standard in the IT space, and we'll come to that a little bit later in the interview. But in the IT space, for small to even medium-sized organizations, for a lot of their machines, it makes sense to enable automatic updates. For a lot of their machines, yes, you want to be aware of the vulnerabilities, but you pretty much want to be as up-to-date as you can be most of the time. There's rare exceptions. Your servers, the SAP server, the Enterprise Resource Planning System, some of your really critical back-end servers, you might manage the updates more carefully because so many people would be impacted if an update busted something critical. But in the industrial space, so much of the industrial process is impacted if an update busts anything. And so everybody in the industrial space, stares hard at these advisories and tries to figure out, do I have to apply this right now? Can I delay it? Is there something else I can do? They ask this sort of much more intensely. So there's certainly interest in this on the IT space, but there's really a different intensity of interest, I think, going forward in the industrial space. A couple of things there, but let me start with I asked about industries. I heard you answer you can't really in a sense characterize the industries who are going to use this sort of more vigorously. My own personal experience is that process industries, refining, power generation, even chemical plants, the high end of them, they tend to be more reluctant I shouldn't say reluctant. They tend to be more cautious about applying patches. It takes them a longer time. They might wait until they've tested them more thoroughly. Whereas in my experience, many, but not all, discrete manufacturers, so we're talking manufacturing automobiles or consumer goods, those discrete manufacturers in my experience, many of them sort of apply security updates more aggressively. Am I mistaken there? Who's adopting this technology the fastest here?
Actually, CSAF is not finished. So CSAF is in the last stages of its community draft. So the review phase of the community draft is over, and the community specification will be published, I think, next week. But we are in close contact with German chemical industry, and they are looking into ways of incorporating, and they're waiting for CSAF. So they have established pilots. They have running pilots which use other feeds of information, commercial feeds of information, quite expensive ones, and they are not content with the qualities they receive. And getting the advisory from the vendor is perhaps the best or the most direct means of receiving these advisories. And having said that, the talks with the German chemical industry are really encouraging that they will apply CSAF quite fast. But, and this is the but, if you are running a continuous process which runs 5 years without interruption, or we should run 5 years without interruption, then you are for sure reluctant to apply a patch or an update which is not absolutely necessary. And then comes the mitigating countermeasure into play. Again, the goal is not, the one thing is to enable companies to know that they are vulnerable and they should apply patches. If they don't do that, that's their decision. That's a risk and business decision. But enabling them is the main. At the moment, I know how the big ones are struggling, and I'm sure that the small ones are not able to struggle at all and are not able to keep up. And to empower them both to do these informed decisions. This is the major point of CSAF, in my opinion.
Can we talk about distribution for a second? I mean, you've talked about automation. You've talked about simplifying the job of managing security advisories. Is there a standard repository for these things? Is this tool going to be picked up by CVE or something so that vendors can push these advisories into a standard place where everyone can see them, so you don't have to go digging around on every vendor's website for them?
Yes. So there is a role of a so-called aggregator, which, for example, BSI is going to be, and we are opting that other governments will do the same. We are still in talks with CISA about this, first of all, issuing their advisories as CSAF. That's not a done deal at the moment, but we are quite hopeful. And BSI will be issuing our advisories in CSAF format mid of next year, hopefully. And with these, and within the standard is described a way where you will find the advisories on the home pages of the vendors. So there is this .well-known directory, and below that there will be subdirectories which point to the place where you can find these advisories without looking all over the websites or searching all over the websites, and you can automate it there as well.
Waterfall Security Solutions is the OT security company. If you're wondering what is the difference between a unidirectional gateway and a firewall, or a so-called unidirectional firewall, then you'll be interested in Waterfall's latest ebook. Firewalls are used throughout both industrial networks and enterprise networks. But best practice demands something stronger, something truly unidirectional at the IT-OT interface. To see the difference that unidirectional security makes, please download the free ebook, Firewalls versus Unidirectional Gateways, from the Waterfall website under the Resources menu.
So I've done a little Googling. I see that CSAF has Oasis as a name on it. Can you talk a little bit more about who's involved in producing this thing, and can you talk about who's involved producing it, who's involved in using it? How's it going?
Sure. OASIS is a group which defines standards. For example, XML was defined at OASIS, SGML as well. And the group behind CSAF, or the companies who are supporting CSAF, are some you might know, like Microsoft, Cisco, Red Hat. These are IT companies, but also Siemens is part of the group which defined or is involved in the making of the standard. And we have commitment from CERT at VDE. This is a German group where the German small and medium enterprises, or the ones like Phoenix Contact or Vago or Beckhoff, are already on the way of adapting, or will be issuing their advisories in CSAF. We are CERT at VDE. And on my side, on BSI side, my colleague Thomas Schmidt was the one driving the standard to the way it looks today. And from a company perspective, we have other major ICS vendors standing by. Some of them are already testing advisories in CSAF format. We are receiving their advisories and are looking over them if they are well formatted, if they are according to spec. And my office even made an editor for writing CSAF documents, which is called Segvisogramm.
So that editor you talked about, is this a person you people have hired, or something else?
No, it's like Vulnogram for generating CVSS vulnerability reports. It's a JavaScript-based, I can only say editor, but not a person, but a software, which is an open source software you can use for producing your own CSAF documents. It works according to the standard, and it was used during the development of the standard. It was not being developed from an end user's perspective of being nice to use. So at the moment, you can use it to test your documents, what you generate, but it's not as a vendor, as someone who issues CSAF advisories in CSAF format. You could use this to import it, to write them, to test them, but I think we are currently in the verge of issuing a tender for a new improved editor, which will make it easier and more streamlined the handling of writing advisories in CSAF.
So if we're talking about advisories, we're talking about patching. Another sort of hot topic in the patching space is SBOM, a software bill of materials. Is that something that's related to CSAF at all?
Yes, I would say that they are related, like cousins, or even a bit closer, but they are not the same. I want to stress this quite heavily. A software bill of materials, it's mandated by President Biden's Executive Order 14028, is an electronic recipe, an electronic sheet, which every software component, every library, every version of this library, perhaps even the compiler flags, are being described and are for the whole supply chain. So there is, when you start programming a software, when you start programming a device, you are using software which is a software of softwares, of other libraries, of other programs and components, sometimes open source, but nearly no one programs SSL from scratch. It's simply not feasible, or HTTP or a network stack. You use commercial ones or you use open source ones. But what happens if there's a vulnerability in one of them? And SBOM is a way to propagate this information throughout the whole supply chain. And there is even a third acronym, which is Vulnerability Exchange Format, WEX, which says, or which allows you to say that I'm not affected as a vendor or an OEM from this certain vulnerability. So everybody around is scared, and are you affected by this vulnerability? And how can you show that you are not affected? And you can do this by using WEX. And one way of using WEX is CSAF. So there's the connection backwards. So if you are CSAF focuses on the end user, on the end customer. It's quite easily transformed into a human readable format. It can be processed with quite easily, and it's not overly complex. While SBOM, if you think how many libraries are within a modern embedded system, and how are their dependencies to other third-party libraries, and did you use a framework which even used more libraries? It's complex. It's getting quite complex, and I heard other talks where they said in third, fourth, fifth order, I was using this and that library, and it was absolutely not visible. And SBOM has to take care of this problem that the systems are so complex. CSAF focuses on the relationship between the manufacturer and the end user. It can be also used between manufacturers within the supply chain, but there's also SBOM, and SBOM is a bit better usable in my opinion, or should be used preferably. But giving SBOM to the customer, to the end user, is something which I think might overwhelm them. Perhaps in a long term, there will be software and there will be support for SBOM all over the supply chain till the end user. But at the moment, we think CSAF is faster. CSAF will be adopted faster because it's easier, and it focuses on this direct relation from the vendor to the end user. And there is also some legal things involved which allow the vendor to show, okay, they did their due diligence, they provided the advisory in this machine-readable format. And with CSAF, with SBOM, it's, I think, more difficult to show this and to get it throughout the whole supply chain, because the supply chain breaks if one does not play.
So Nate, a couple of words of sort of clarification there. I would sum up, Gents, with an example. Let's say, a library 5 levels deep in a piece of software has, someone's discovered a vulnerability. The vendor for that library, SSL, I think, is a classic example. It's called TLS nowadays, but it's the crypto library that every piece of software uses. They don't all use the same library. There's many vendors of SSL libraries out there, but pretty much everyone uses this function and nobody writes it themselves except the vendors. So now one of the SSL libraries that, I bought a product and they bought a subsystem from someone else who bought a subsystem from someone else who bought the SSL library. The vendor for the SSL library puts out an advisory. If there's automation that has the SBOMs in it, that has these advisories in it, the automation might send a warning to the end user saying, oh, look, one of the vendors 5 levels deep in software, that you have 17 software products that use that vendor indirectly, installed on 43% of your machines, they've just issued a security advisory. What can the end user do? Well, they can't do anything yet because they haven't purchased and installed that library directly. That vendor is not their vendor. It's their vendor's vendor. Oh, but they can start paying attention, and one after another, working their way up the dependency chain. Vendors might say, vendor A might say, I've looked at this, I use that library, but I don't use the function that's damaged like this. I use a completely different part of this large, complex library. This advisory does not apply to me. So they, in a sense, issue a negative advisory. And, he called that, the vulnerability exchange format permits that sort of negative advisory to come out. So the other vendors up the chain from that, from vendor A say, I'm not affected. But, vendor B says, oh, I am affected, and they issue an advisory. And you can see these advisories kind of working their way up the technology stack until the top level vendor, for 13 of the 17 products that the end user has actually purchased, 13 of them issue advisories, and now there's security updates available, and the end user takes action. So this is what he was talking about. The SBOM sort of helps the vendors figure out these dependencies and figure out when one of their vendors has a problem, if they need to investigate and issue an advisory. So it's a sort of a more vendor tool. It's kind of advisory to very sophisticated end users, but there's nothing really the end user can do with it. The end user has to wait for their vendors, the high-level vendors, the one they bought the stuff from, to come out with an advisory or not, and come out with a patch or not, because they can't update the vendor's code themselves. So can we explore this linkage, between SBOM and advisories a little bit more for a second? My understanding is the goal of the SBOM is that, as you said, in product development where libraries are deeply nested, you might have a lot of components in your product. Each component might have a lot of subcomponents and so on. And so your SBOM really is quite large. If this is true of many vendors, then when you see a vulnerability come out in one of these deeply nested libraries, if the SBOM system is working, will you not suddenly see hundreds or thousands of CSAF advisories come out, one from each vendor in the world who's using, in your example, the SSL library? Is this going to work?
Yes, I'm quite sure this will work because, as I said, we are not focusing on the vulnerability. We are focusing on the vendor itself and at the relationship between the vendor and the end user or the customer. And the customer will also get a lot of advisories at that moment if this vulnerability affects a very core library. But in my opinion, that's completely okay because they can make this decision and also see which vendor has not reacted, so they can see the gaps. And for me, the tracking of the vulnerability is not feasible for an end user because they don't have the knowledge to know what's inside of the nested libraries. They simply don't see it. And the responsibility for these nested libraries lies at the vendor side and not at the customer side, because the customer has no means to seeing that. And if there is no SBOM, and I assume SBOM will take some time till it's really fully established, we need something to bridge during this time. And CSAF is a good means of doing so. And even there are some I wouldn't say some thoughts given or some hesitation on SBOM that if SBOM is openly available and you see a core vulnerability and with one snip you can see all the affected products, then the bad guys can do the same. And this introduces a new whole attack surface. I'm no friend of security by obscurity, but we have to be careful how we will open the doors to anybody who are not prepared for because this will accelerate the 0 days and the 1 days quite heavily and will increase their amount. If with a snip of a finger you can see all the affected products, and this is one thing which is, in my opinion, not fully thought through SBOM.
Andrew, I totally see what Jens is saying, and I agree with him for the most part, but it's also giving me a little bit of deja vu. It reminds me, I think we must have talked about this before on the show, of the sort of older debates about vulnerability disclosure, releasing to the world the information that may be of use to security researchers and the folks we don't necessarily want having this information in equal parts.
That's right. And that old debate was resolved in favor of disclosure. Give the end users the information they need to figure out how much trouble they're in and how urgently they really should apply these security updates. I think the problem here is not a difference in kind, because again, SBOM is a kind of disclosure. It's a difference in, let's say, scope, a difference in breadth or depth. With a single vendor and a single vulnerability, the disclosure tends to come promptly when the security update is available. So here's the disclosure. Oh, I'm in trouble. Pull the update, install it. There we go. With the SBOM, if you get a disclosure of a vulnerability deep in the stack, and there's a detailed list out there of who's using this stuff and who's going to be affected by it, it might take time for the first level vendor to react to the disclosure and produce their security update, so that the next level vendor can react and incorporate that security update into their product, and they can issue an update. It might take quite a bit longer between the time the vulnerability is disclosed and the time an update from the top level vendor is available to the end user. And so, this is what I assume people are debating. I haven't been tracking that debate, but off the top of my head, something that makes sense to me is that you might keep mum about the vulnerability for a period of time, a short period of time, but give your customers, the vendors that use your stuff and the vendors that use their stuff, give them a fighting chance to start work on to get their security updates to come out, do a coordinated disclosure. These are all things that I imagine are being talked about. Yeah, I think in the end, it's the thing is likely to be resolved the way vulnerability announcements were, in favor of disclosure. It's a question, I think, of how, not whether. This has been great, gents. Thank you for joining us. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Before we let you go, is there a thought you'd like to leave with our listeners? Would you like to sum this up somehow?
Absolutely. CSAF is not a done deal. So CSAF is in its infant stages. And to make CSAF work, we will need to generate a critical mass. And all the listeners should start thinking about CSAF and try to ask their suppliers what they think about CSAF. So at the moment we have a chicken and egg problem. That means nobody knows about CSAF, and because nobody knows about CSAF, nobody demands the usage of CSAF or asks for CSAF. And we need to break this. And to establish this critical mass, just ask your supplier. So from mid of next year, we expect you to supply your advisories in CSAF. And write this in the tender or put it somewhere and ask them nicely, but be firm, be strict about it. And then you also can distinguish you have a means of distinguishing the vendors who care about security and who are agile and are upfront about it and will take it seriously, and the ones who are a bit reluctant and perhaps are not so fast and even might not be able to care so much about issuing fast and good advisories. And this is what CSAF stands for, or this is what CSAF represents, reducing the time to patch and giving you the ability to make informed decisions. And lastly, I want to thank Thomas Schmidt from my team, who pushed CSAF to the way it is now, and he did a great job.
So that just about wraps up your interview with Jens Wiesner, Andrew. You got anything to bring us out with?
Sure. I'll just emphasize automation. What we have here is a standard that's going to enable automation. As far as I know, there are products available that do some of this, patch vulnerability management already. But to my knowledge, all of the information in those products databases are coming from those product vendors who are going out and to semi-automatically or manually parsing the vulnerability reports, entering the stuff into the machine. This standard will automate all that. It'll democratize the product space of automation that can manage these vulnerabilities and the patch processes, and all of that is good. And it's especially important to the industrial space where pretty much everybody cares about patching. Patching is such a hard thing to do, and so any kind of automation that you can get, any kind of reducing the price or increasing the scope or increasing the power of these automation tools, I think is going to be very important to the industrial space.
All right. Thanks to Jens for speaking with you, Andrew, and thank you, Andrew, for speaking with me.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Nate.
This has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thanks to everyone out there listening.